What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 TRPGs that I struggled with, or more specifically, parts of those TRPGs that I struggled with, as I review these games after 100% fairly frequently, and while much of the experience can be pretty straightforward, sometimes there are specific aspects of that that are more difficult than the game would be under normal circumstances, which is certainly worth keeping in mind, because overall I wouldn't consider a lot of these especially difficult outside of the specific instances that I'll be talking about. But TRPGs, or tactical RPGs, of course focus on tactical combat. Typically speaking, this is turn-based, but not always. And part of the fun of these games is overcoming challenges exactly like these. So because of that, I wouldn't let this dissuade you from playing any of these games. In fact, some of them I'm pretty fond of. But with no further ado, let's actually get started and jump into this thing. First up, we have Warhammer 40k Chaos Gate Daemonhunters. One of my favorite recent TRPGs, actually. But an interesting thing about this game is that you're really, under most circumstances, only controlling about 4 characters, and you're often very much so outnumbered, meaning that capitalizing on the action economy is a very key part of the game, and a lot of the mechanics that go into that revolve around giving your units more action points, or AP, that they can then attack with and move with. In fact, using this method will get you through pretty much the entire game, often trivializing most bosses, right up until you get to the very last boss, in which you're suddenly controlling 2 squads, and this method no longer works. Or at least not as effectively, I should say. Because the last boss has a lot of mechanics that seemed almost specifically designed to counter this type of gameplay and drag the fight out a little bit. And as such, the sprint approach that I had been using through much of the game turns into more of a marathon for the last fight, which is quite the shift in tone, as you might imagine. So that fight took me several tries of sort of reorienting myself and trying out different strategies until I finally overcame it. But for a game I mostly breezed through, that fight stopped me in my tracks for a good little while. But that brings us to number 2 on the list. And this is King Arthur: A Knight's Tale, a sort of gritty, dark fantasy take on the classic King Arthur fantasy stuff, and it's a game that comes with a good bit of challenge. However, towards the end of the game, there is quite the difficulty spike after you finish up the main story. There's a sort of last chapter to the game where you can fight tons of battles against a newly unveiled enemy, which is the Fomorians. However, these guys have massively increased health and damage compared to the people you were just fighting. It's a huge difficulty spike that you kind of have to work to overcome and readjust your tactics a bit. And while you could very simply not do this, much of the game is pretty much over at this point, there is a sort of last boss at the end of this little chapter, the Baelor. So I kept pushing through it to get to this guy, and honestly, I would say the last chapter was significantly less fun than most of the rest of the game for me personally, because of these really high health pools. Now, it's certainly not impossible or anything, and if anything, I had to really adjust my approach quite a bit. And while I do find overcoming these types of challenges pretty rewarding, King Arthur, while it is honestly a really good game, I think could stand to get a balance pass or two and flatten out some of the difficulty spikes, honestly, as the way they handle their itemization, in my opinion, is part of what causes it, but that's a discussion for another video. And this brings us to number 3 on our list, and it is probably the most interesting title on the list in this regard because it's the only one that is real-time with pause. And this is Tower of Time. Now, real-time with pause TRPGs are rare. There's a handful of them, but they're definitely very uncommon. Tower of Time is one such game. As you move through the Tower of Time, you'll find yourself in these little sort of combat arenas where you're fending off waves and waves of enemies as they come at you in real-time with pause combat. Now, on lower difficulties, this can honestly feel a little hack and slash, but on probably normal and above, it's definitely more of a tactics situation where you have to strategically use your characters and their abilities to fend off these waves. One thing that is also unique about Tower of Time is that a lot of its AoEs use a sort of drawing effect where you actually draw out the area of effect, which adds a really interesting layer to the strategy because you can kind of manipulate and set up, say, a wall that is impassable, or the exact shape of a rain of arrows, that kind of thing. And this added a certain layer to it that I haven't really seen in any other games in this regard, or used in this specific way. And a big part of what I struggled with here was just figuring out exactly how to approach this, because just that small change of being able to manually draw the area of effect adds a certain element of player agency to the combat that wouldn't be there otherwise. Now, luckily, the combat encounters themselves are relatively set, meaning that when you fight a specific enemy in a specific place, it's a curated encounter, if you will. So there's a little bit of learning here where this enemy is going to come in at this time, so I can use this ability, which is pretty much how I eventually got through it. But it's such a different take on TRPG combat that I had seen up to that point that the lack of familiarity was the struggle more than anything else. Very cool game though, I really recommend you check it out. And that brings us to number 4 on the list, and this is Lost Eidolons. Lost Eidolons is a relatively recent release that takes a great deal of inspiration from Fire Emblem. Now, the normal version of this game I mostly breezed through. There were 1 or 2 fights in its 27 chapters that were somewhat of a challenge, but normal for the most part was very, very doable. The only part of normal that was a challenge in any way at all was the last boss, because the last boss behaves much differently than all of the other units in the game. And it's more of a mechanical fight, meaning that there are several mechanics you have to work around and not get hit by to really manage it effectively, because the last boss is capable of taking out your entire team very much so by himself. And you combine this with the initial turn limit that was in the game, and you have a pretty rough experience, which on its own, honestly not that bad. What was difficult was the hard mode version of that fight, which if I had not prepared for by running through normal first, I probably would have just had to restart or something and change my approach, because it's not really a fight you see coming up until that point, and it's a huge difficulty spike in comparison to everything that came before, which makes sense for a last boss. But combine all these very strong stats, very sudden and unique mechanics that are only seen here, with placing the boss at the end of a long battle where you've already used most of your resources and spells when you get to the guy, because the game has a turn limit, and you're in for a pretty rough experience. Now, since launch, they've actually removed that turn limit, or made it optional, I should say, which means already this is probably not the experience most people will have, but it is the experience I had, and it was quite the challenge, which is a very similar case for the next game up on our list, and that is Hard West 2, with its Nightmare difficulty. Much like Lost Eidolons, this game came with an initial turn limit on that particular difficulty that has since been removed. You can turn it off, and I think there is a separate option which is more or less the same difficulty, but also with the turn limit now. I believe that's how they implemented it. Hard West 2, due to this turn limit, felt much more like a puzzle game as a result. Less so for Lost Eidolons, but Hard West 2 in particular really kind of felt like a puzzle game on this difficulty, because you had to approach it in a certain way with certain equipment and get to certain points by certain turns, or you just weren't going to make it because the turn limit was pretty tight. Whereas Lost Eidolons, it was relatively generous. But in addition to the turn limit, Hard West 2 also, at launch when I played it, had a bit of an issue with a specific enemy type called Blackhearts. Basically, if you could not kill these guys in one turn, they would all but one-shot you as a result. And combined with the turn limit where you're trying to move very quickly, you could get into a situation where you're just damaging who you can as much as you can. But Blackhearts have an attack that at the time did more damage based on how much damage they had taken. So if you'd get them really close to death trying to move quickly, they would turn around and just one-shot a character as a result, basically, meaning that you had to plan around killing them in one turn, because hitting them if you weren't going to kill them was a bad idea. And those two things combined, the Blackheart enemies with the turn limit, were probably the single hardest part of that entire experience with Hard West 2. Both of which have since been changed. They actually nerfed the Blackhearts a bit so they wouldn't completely destroy people, even on the easier difficulties. On Nightmare, you would pretty much expect it, but they would do this on every difficulty. And as such, the Blackhearts saw some tweaking. But that is going to do it for today. 5 TRPGs that I struggled with, or at least parts of them that I did. But by all means, let me know how you felt about the list and leave your own comments about TRPGs that are difficult or that you struggled with down below, as there are a great many of them with wildly varying difficulties, and I'm pretty sure I can already guess a few that I'm likely to see in the comments. But regardless of all that, hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.